Those of you who've been following these totally not post-stream ruminations that are definitely ruminations, wink wink, know that I like to play some music from the game in question as a background thing, just as a thing. Well, not only is the music in this game extraordinarily copy-wronged, as I discovered when I put up the VOD, but also it's ridiculously loud to the point where you definitely will not be able to hear me. So in the spirit of that, so Ruiner. This is one of the most clear-cut examples of a sensory overload game I've ever seen. The visuals, the audio, the flickering, the whole game is designed to just constantly bombard your senses the whole way you're going through it. It's kind of invokes the feeling of being in a major nightclub, if you've ever been in one, which I actually have in my real life. And not a big fan, if I'm being honest. We did smash through this game. I think it was like a 5-hour game, very, very short. But we smashed through this game relatively quickly, and I have to be honest with you. I know I'm an old man and whatever, but I had to actually lie down afterwards. I had to go. I had to take a Dramamine, and I had to go, and I just had to lay down for an hour because that game was painful to play through for me. Now, the main reason I'm starting with this is because that's the biggest warning. That's the biggest proviso right off the gate. If you have seizure issues, if you have nausea issues, if you have loud sounds issues, if you have flickering lights issues, if you have any of that stuff, you need to not play this game. If, on the other hand, you're fine, you'll be fine. This is a kind of a twin-stick shooter with a little bit more depth to it than that. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of build, a lot of kit, and that's always cool. Although most of it is kind of unnecessary. Forgive me for agreeing with the ever-esteemed Mandalore Gaming here, but one of the weirdest aspects of this game is that while the game gives you plenty of tools to use, most of them are kind of either unnecessary or only work based on complete RNG. Now, I will give the game credit. You can actually swap on the fly, and I do mean on the fly. Like if you're in the middle of a boss fight and you're like, oh, this isn't working, you can just pull up the menu and change your build and loadout like that. And that's awesome. And it does kind of encourage you to experiment and play around with however you want to do it, and that's cool too. You also die near instantly if you're not paying attention, but that's fine because that's the nature of the game. It's part of the frenetic pace of the game, and the game definitely has the kind of checkpointing to support that. Although, the fact that it never actually recorded my scores, despite giving me scores as I went through each stage, was really, really weird. Also, the final boss fight, if you can call it that, isn't. And frankly, only the second to last encounter is the only thing I would even call a proper boss fight at all, because most of the encounters in this game that are bosses are just a guy with like 1 or 2 additional mechanics, and that's kind of it. This is a weird game, is what I'm trying to get at, from a gameplay perspective, from purely a mechanical perspective, because it does several things that work, but don't sometimes, but not really. It's still fun. I still actually enjoy the experience for what it's worth. And you're probably wondering why I haven't talked about the narrative, and that's because the narrative... My sister came down in the middle of my playthrough, and when I started describing to her some of the story, she left. Because it is really, really dark in ways that some people might not be able to tolerate. So, bit of a warning on that front too. The level of human abuse, mass-produced systemic abuse, the kind of thing where nobody notices or cares about the bodies that are quite literally, as well as metaphorically, being generated by the system that is churning through people, burning them out, and then using them again, and then burning them out again, and then tossing aside the husk. That's the kind of setting that this setting is. It is extraordinarily dystopian, to an extent that most dystopias can only dream of. I don't want to sound political here, but this is the extreme version of capitalism. I'm not pro-capitalism, I'm not anti-capitalism, don't even start. The point is, if you take just about any philosophy to an extreme, it tends to be bad, and this is no exception. So this takes capitalism, the idea that the people are their only purpose of people is to be part of a production line, to produce something, and then to have that value added to society, and takes it to an extreme, and like I said, burns people out and then burns out what's left. It functionally kills these people, but we're not even sure exactly how much of that is something they're conscious of while it's happening. There's also a wonderful sequence, and which is just a little extra bit of horror there, where we go into one of the server rooms. How many of you have ever been to a server room in real life? Raise my hand. They're hot. Servers generate, electricity. The currents that we run through circuits generate a lot of heat, and they require their own specific type of air conditioning and airflow. And you have to actually do some engineering to make that work. Otherwise, those suckers are going to burn out, right? So we go into a futuristic server room, which has all the problems I just mentioned. And then you remember that those servers are being run by people. So that's a thing. This is an extremely horrifying, extremely sensory overload kind of a game. It is fun for what it is, but I will say, and this is kind of a spoiler, if you're interested in playing through this and you've gotten past all the warnings I've given you right now, I should mention that the end of the campaign ends on the biggest to-be-continued I've ever seen. In fact, this feels like Chapter 1, or possibly even Chapter 0, like the prologue of a story that, to my knowledge, hasn't even gotten started yet. With that, be warned. If you're interested, go for it. You can certainly do worse. It's not exactly all that expensive. And like I said, it's a very, very short game. It also has a speedrun mode, a challenge mode, and an arena mode for those of you who want to actually try out something different on your second or third or fifth or 18th playthrough. It's definitely a game designed for you to keep playing it over and over and over. I guess I don't have anything else to add. I'm going to go and move on to the next one. We've had a weird string of games lately. Like, we did Invisible Ink, which barely had any story. And then we did Oxygen Not Included, which had story tacked on after the fact. Then we did Wargroove, which had a terrible story. Then Squadrons, which had a terrible story that was tacked on after the fact. Now we have Ruiner, which has a story that barely begins. What's the next game on the list? Oh.